We as society are all Pavlov's dogs now. Men are disturbed not by things, but by the view which they take of them. Dr. Ivan Pavlov, the famous Russian physiologist who is primarily known for his work in classical conditioning, which has informed much thinking around behaviorism in psychology. A fascinating and sinister section from the book reads, quote, "What is wrong with these poor creatures?" Sokolov asked. "What have you given them to make them so nervous?" Zeleny laughed. "This is our prize project. Ivan Petrovich Pavlov attributes great importance to it. As you know, he has proved that the central nervous system directs and controls all functions of the body in man and animals alike. But now he wants us to establish through a series of experiments that such diseases as cancer are also influenced by the central nervous system, or that neurotic persons whose nervous system is overstrained are much more predisposed to cancer than persons with a well-balanced normal nervous system." How? I was fascinated. By using the technique of conditioned reflexes. First, by forming them with a bell or a light, and then inhibiting them. This technique can induce a state of extreme neurosis in normal dogs. You can see yourself that they are neurotic, and they were indeed. Now, Zeleny continued, we shall see if a malignant tumor develops in these dogs. We might know in a year or two. It was to take more than 20 years, however, to complete the investigation. Not until after the deaths of Pavlov and Zeleny were the results published by Dr. Maria Petrova and other Pavlov students, partially confirming their master's theory. It is now well known that induced stress, fear, and anxiety are linked to a myriad of physical and psychological disorders. That is irrefutable. Public health initiatives often implore us to lead healthy and stress-free lives for the good of our physical and psychological health.
The family system enmeshment, like when this marriage is dysfunctional, where there's an intimacy vacuum. See, nature abhors a vacuum. The children will try to fill in the vacuum. So in a family system, let's say Jack and Jill get married pregnant and they have Susie. Susie may be a lost child. That is, she's the child that the way she can matter in that family is by getting lost. Or this child may be the hero child. Or this child may be the scapegoat child. All of these are forms of enmeshment, family system enmeshment. Meaning that as the children fill in for this dysfunctional marriage, or those of you who saw the family series, I had the big mobile, this beautiful mobile that Trudy Sween created, and I'd go over and touch the mobile and show you how if one part of the system is affected, all the parts of the system get affected. So when we began to look at the family, enmeshment is one of the ways that you were spiritually wounded. Because like I was a star in my family. I was the president of every class. But this is the way that I had to give up my reality. What to do about these rigid family enmeshment roles where you lost your true self. And it's very important that we learn that that our inner child may be hidden under these kinds of enmeshments. And that we need to decide what parts of these roles we want to keep playing, because I went to be a priest. That was another way to be a star. I was a therapist for a number of years. There was another way to be a star. And caretaker was another role that I had. So it's very, very important that we understand physical abuse, sexual abuse, family enmeshment, all as forms of spiritual wounding. You don't get your developmental dependency needs met, you grow up to be an adult child. You grow up to be a child who didn't get his developmental needs met as you grow up. Like you didn't get your infancy needs met. So you have a lot of touch needs, or you have a lot of trust needs. You didn't get your toddler needs met, so you can't say no. You're manipulated by anger. You don't know how to resolve conflict. You have a fight, you don't talk for 2 years because you have no conflict resolution skills. That's all about developmental dependency needs. Now, emotional abuse, it's all emotional abuse. It's all emotional abuse. If you're being incested, you're being emotionally abused. If you're being physically abused, you're being emotionally abused. Abuse is the training for addiction. Because when you're being abused, you're being taught power, control, shame, secrecy, fear, distrust, distance, and the numbing of emotions. Those are the basis of relationships. That's what you're being trained to believe. And you begin to confuse that with love. Now, it's very important that we understand that emotions are primary. The primacy of emotion. That our emotions, the emotional brain develops before the thinking brain. That in the limbic system is there. We have 131 million addicts in the United States. Those are all emotional diseases. See, we wonder, why do we have so much addiction? Because we programmatically and systematically repress emotion. And I'm telling you, you can grow up and be in your head and not even know how bad you feel. You can grow up and be in your head. I survived getting in my head. Now, emotion is primary. It moves us. It's energy. Our anger moves us to fight. Our fear moves us to flight. Our sadness moves us to tears. According to Montague at Princeton, we are the only animals who weep. Other animals cry, but they do not weep. They do not shed tears. That tears discharge energy. And when we see later in this program the original pain work, the segments that I've got of people doing original pain work, what you're going to see people discharging energy because this energy has been blocked. You're going to see a woman working on her anger that was blocked at 5 years old, and that she's still a 5-year-old when she gets around her mom because she's never been allowed to express her anger. She's never been allowed to express her sadness. A lot of men have repressed, frozen grief. A lot of us can't celebrate because all of our emotions have been... See, if your fear and your anger and your sadness are all repressed, it's going to be hard to get to your joy. I can remember standing in Las Vegas, hitting sevens on the slot machine, standing there, but everybody around me was jumping up and down, but I'm like frozen. It's like I can't get into it because this energy in my body is not there. It's all frozen.
In Dr. Robert Scare's trauma model, this is explained very well. So here he writes, trauma and learned responses. Traumatic life experiences often contribute to learned habits of movement and posture that reflect the self-protective movement patterns associated with those threats. Many of these trauma-related movement patterns affect the way that we move, sit, and stand. They may lead to patterns of movement and posture that are abnormal, and they may inhibit our normal coordination and our learning of other desirable motor skills. Self-protective movement and postural patterns of the experienced trauma are stored in the brain and the body's survival memory. These learned dysfunctional patterns persist because they are, in a metaphorical sense, necessary for defense against future threats, similar to those that elicited the defense in the first place. If traumatic memories are implanted in the brain, internal cues such as dreams, imagined scenarios and memories, as well as sensory information from the external environment will evoke motor, autonomic, somatic, and visceral responses to a perceived threat. This process is almost entirely unconscious and occurs typically before any conscious recognition or awareness. Yeah, so the nervous system reacts before you even think. Using the term psychological as opposed to physical to explain a physical symptom or somatic feeling state or emotional event defies the obvious, that all perceptions, thoughts, symbols, or experiences have a physiological basis within the mind-body continuum. The fight-flight-freeze response. All animals must have the capacity to learn from life-threatening experiences. All animals learn to survive through the functions of the areas of the brain that process information through a complex behavioral process that has been termed the fight-flight-freeze response. The brain pathways and behaviors in this response are common to all animals from reptile to primates, but these instincts only form a template on which exposure to a series of life threats builds specific survival skills. Whether one fights or flees when exposed to a threat must be learned very quickly through such experiences. The information from these learning experiences must be stored in unconscious form in order to be of use in the survival game. It must be capable of triggering a predictable behavioral response learned through trial and error without thinking or planning. The process through which we learn these survival skills is called classical conditioning, a term coined by Pavlov. All threatening experiences, even those that are successfully resolved, will prompt unconscious responses related to cues from that experience. Persistence of the conditioned response to the conditioned stimulus is dependent on reinforcement. The internal or external repetition of the traumatic event or events of a similar kind will deliver such reinforcement. The process of classical conditioning involves intrinsic or unconscious memory, part of which is procedural memory, the part that we use to learn skills, like riding on a bike. You never ever forget that once you have learned it, right? Survival depends upon classical conditioning through procedural memory. The freeze response. It's very important to be aware of the freeze response too. And Dr. Robert Scare has mentioned that in particular, while others always just mention fight-flight and forget the freeze response. So, sometimes fight or flight options are no longer available. Under these circumstances, a third survival option is available, the freeze response. The freeze response, common to all species, indeed may allow the animal to survive, but in mammals it sometimes comes at a terrible cost. Animals who survive the freeze response experience an unconscious discharge of all of the energy and stored memories of the threat and failed escape through stereotyped body movements as the animal awakens. If they don't experience this discharge, a host of adverse behavioral and health problems may follow. And what are we conditioned to? Do no discharge. That's a real issue in our society. Because the discharge may look really weird to how we are conditioned to view normal behavior, because we may shake, we may run in place, we may, I don't know, scream or do other movements that are considered weird. This discharge is suffocated. We are not allowed to do that, or else it's considered disordered behavior or even challenging behavior. The domestication of the human race has led to a true dilemma. Classical conditioning in this context can fool the brain and lead to a host of inappropriate and ineffectual survival behaviors. When this happens, we may say that trauma has occurred. When fight or flight are unsuccessful or not possible, a third instinctual and quite unconscious option will be exercised. The animal collapses and becomes immobile. This is the freeze response. The so-called shell shock of World War I soldiers. You can still find these videos on YouTube. If the freeze response is successful in preventing the animal from being killed, the animal will gradually emerge from immobility. The freeze response is made possible through the functioning of the parasympathetic nervous system. When the parasympathetic response is very strong or extreme, the animal in freeze is in a precarious state of abnormally dysregulated and fluctuating autonomic nervous system activity. One of the expressions of the freeze response in humans is the phenomenon of dissociation. Dissociation is reflecting a state of shock, stunning, trance, numbing of emotion, and cognitive fogging. Dissociation is physiologically the same as the freeze. The work of Peter Levine showed that PTSD patients experienced a dramatic clearing of many of their symptoms when they were allowed to complete the motor discharge of their freeze response through unique therapeutic behavioral techniques. In the absence of this freeze discharge, the energy of the intense arousal associated with the threat and attempted escape remains bound in the body and brain, leading to a host of abnormal symptoms that we attribute to PTSD or complex PTSD. Levine also noted that repeated freeze events without discharge seem to be cumulative, adding to a progressive worsening of post-traumatic symptoms and to the development of progressive helplessness in the face of threat. So suddenly your default response can be a freeze. You just go into freeze. So now compare that to so-called autistic meltdowns. They are not used to attain a specific outcome. The reaction is involuntary and cannot be controlled as an intense emotion takeover, and tension built up is released via stimming, repetitive movements, zoning out, which is dissociation, freeze response, right? Crying, stomping, and stomping or screaming, that's the fight response, in my opinion. So meltdowns can look like withdrawal, which is again dissociation, freeze. Curling up into a ball is a fetal position. You protect yourself from an outer threat. Growling, again. What do animals do to defend themselves? In nature. Cats, they growl. Just to show, okay, you have come too close, stay away. Horses, flattened ears. And if you don't listen to that, only then they will actually defend themselves and attack their space. You can observe that in nature very clearly. And we humans always think we are so different, we are civilized, blah blah. No, we have still these responses: fight, flight, freeze. But we are domesticated to not react in that way. But in the face of threat, it just still comes through. It's only natural.
When I drank, when I ate pills, whoa, could I let that energy out? That's why Carl Menninger said that alcoholism is like a man on fire running into the sea to put out the fire, but drowning. It's a disease of a disease. That the root of the disease is not healthy shame, which is our limits when children blush or are embarrassed. That is, they're caught with their pants down, they're caught exposed. This is a natural human emotion. Problem in English is we only have one word for shame. French has two, German has two, Latin has two, Greek has two. Homer used the word as awe in the face of the gods. The highest virtue for a medieval knight of the Round Table in the Percival myth was shame, meaning modesty and humility. Healthy shame is an enormously important emotion. It is the root of conscience and morality. So without a healthy sense of shame, you don't have any conscience or morality. Now, most of us get all of these emotions shamed. And when you grow up in a family and you've got adult children for parents, you can't possibly get your developmental dependency needs met, because those needs are there. Those needs are there, and you can't get them met because your parents have never gotten their needs met. So if your mom was not allowed to have her sadness, she's not going to let you have your sadness. Like when you see some of the work that we're going to show you, it's very important that the people in the groups, when they're working, be there for each other, not try to take each other out of the emotion. But you watch yourself wanting to take the person out of their emotion. Now, this is the model that McLean uses at Chicago, the tripartite brain, that there's a visceral brain, an emotional brain, a thinking brain, and they develop just like that. So that this brain, this emotional brain, develops before the thinking brain, meaning that thinking comes out of feeling and not the other way around. That's why toxic shame in my belief system and in my treatment work cannot be cured with rational emotive techniques. You can't stay up in your head and cure stuff that's down here. So original pain work means getting the emotion out, doing the grief work, doing the anger work, allowing yourself to tremble with fear, allowing yourself to have the motion of the energy.
So again, looking at expressing your distress through the autistic lens, I just think autistic meltdowns are nothing else. But we can't be domesticated as well as so-called non-autistic people. But then when meltdowns are punished, it will result in additional trauma, like here described. Autistic meltdowns are one of the most difficult parts of autism for me. My meltdowns were not dealt with well in my childhood. My parents thought I was just throwing tantrums. They thought I could control what was happening, which was not the case at all. I was usually locked in my room during these meltdowns. This has added trauma beyond belief. To have been shoved into a room and have the doorknob ripped out of my hand while all I wanted was some deep pressure. Comfort. Feeling safe. That's nothing else. I still have night terrors where I wake up screaming about being trapped. Yeah, so you cannot flee, which is the flight response. You cannot get away. So what do? You freeze. And the problem is, in autism, survival response gets pathologized and called a meltdown. And we can't control meltdowns. Of course, you shouldn't actually, because it's a survival response to a perceived threat when you feel overwhelmed and stressed out. That's what we are designed to do. Fight the threat, get away from the threat, or play dead to survive. And here she writes about banging her head, hitting her head repeatedly with the fist. I think this is just the result of having no solution. So you implode because you feel trapped, you feel frustrated, there is no way out, there is no solution. And she says deep pressure can lessen the intensity of the meltdown. Again, feeling safe. safety. It's about feeling safe in a threatening environment, being comforted, being validated, being seen, being heard, having our humanity recognized and not pathologized.
When it comes to your past trauma, no one is coming to save you from the effects. You'll have to seek that out. So don't just suffer through your life saving up your problems for weekly appointments with someone who's supposed to know what to do. Even if you have access to a therapist, and even if they know how to help you and you actually feel better, you are going to still need tools and awareness that you are in charge of it. It's you who will be recognizing your trauma reactions and devising how you'll change the pattern, and then working every day to fine-tune and integrate those changes. You are sovereign over your healing. Second truth, therapy isn't the only way to heal from trauma. And for some people with CPTSD from childhood, talking about trauma only makes it worse. Our culture says that talk therapy is the way to deal with this kind of problem, but many people's experience feeling like it does more harm than good is backed up by recent research. There's a time and a place to tell your story and get validation and have that blessed experience of understanding what happened. But if talk therapy feels bad and doesn't seem to go anywhere, or if you're like the millions of people who can't afford talk therapy, I want you to know there are simple tools you can learn and use that just might make all the difference.
One of the most important tools is actually fixing the way you eat. So removing all excitotoxins, foods that you might be reacting to. If you have these kinds of symptoms, then also look at the way you eat and correct it, remove trigger foods so they will not put more stress on your overwhelmed system. So that's a very important tool. And from there, you can go on and find other ways how to regulate your nervous system. So breathing exercises, so simple, you can just do them everywhere. Going into nature, highly regulating. You don't need a therapist for that. Nature is your therapist. Yeah, so there are many tools you can find for yourself. Empower yourself. Do your research. See what works for your system, what doesn't work. So yeah, of course you need to experiment, try things. Step by step, work yourself through. And don't be dependent on therapists, because it's very hard to find one that actually really gets you. It's difficult to find a good therapist. Many of them have not worked through their own trauma. They're just using models on you. So, I don't think that's the best approach, actually. The best approach is be your own therapist and find your own solutions. And yes, of course, educate yourself on these things. Understand how All of this is connected. See everything in the whole context of your personal individual experience. And you will find the right solutions for your personal needs.